Okay, so now we're going to do the third part. This is the final part of chapter 3. So as we move on and look at some of the other causes of terrorism, we're going to look at political violence as a strategic choice. We'll look at acts of political will, adversaries in the war on terrorism. So terrorism can be seen as one of the possible strategies by those who believe that change can be brought about through acts of political will. And the force of will is considered the driving impetus of change. So Martin defines acts of political will as an effort to force change and consists of strategic choices made by ideologically motivated revolutionaries who pursue victory by sheer force of will. So, in essence, it's a rational and a strategic choice by revolutionaries to use these tactics to defeat their enemy. So, Martin uses in the book Mao Zedong's Chinese Revolution, in which Mao, his military doctrine was actually a strategy in the book. He says it was simple. He was to indoctrinate the army, win the people over, hit, run, and fight forever. And eventually Mao was successful in what started out as a terrorist war, eventually went to a guerrilla warfare, and eventually he was able to conquer the country and turn China into a communist power. So the strategy of the People's War, which Mao used, and he called it the People's War, he was able to win over the popular people, and it became a popular movement. And that's important because it started out slowly, and he was able to win over public opinion and transfer and get people to back him in his guerrilla warfare. And so he was able to fight a more powerful army, and the more and more people got behind him, the more and more powerful the insurgency became until he was able to finally overthrow the government. Okay, so Mao is an example of an act of political will eventually overthrowing a government. Early on in the campaign, Mao took over the revolutionary from Chiang Kai shek, and he eventually was able to sway public opinion and get the public behind him. But before doing so, he was viewed as a revolutionary, and he didn't hold the popular opinion was not behind him. Eventually, he gained enough power and was able to overthrow the Chinese government and install a communist regime. So, at first, the Chinese government was the adversary in the war on terror. And so now we're going to look at different adversaries and the different reasons for our war on terror. And perception, again, we're going to talk about perception a little bit and the cultural disconnect and the adversaries in the war on terrorism and the disconnect that they suffer. So the perception, Westerners here, we see Islamic terrorists as being directed against our civilization. They hate us for who we are, is the quote. And the Muslim world, they see terrorists, Islamic terrorists, as a response to the unjust American policies in the Middle East. They hate us for what we do to them. A former CIA official, Michael Shura, asserts that terrorism is a defense against U.S. policies that are considered threats to the very being of the Muslim world. And in the book, on page 63, a religion professor, Bruce Lawrence, observed, "They hate us because of what we do, and it seems to contradict who we are. The major issue is that our policy seems to contradict our own basic values." And again, American foreign policy in the Middle East, namely because of our staunch ally and backing of Israel, has made us unpopular amongst many of the countries that are not allied with Israel. And again, we'll talk about Israel and the Middle East later on in the term. So one key to stopping Islamic terrorism may require us Americans to recognize that the collateral damage that we cause, um, namely our civilian deaths from air raids, um, media coverage of mistreatment of the detainees, Muslim detainees, um, and persistent presence of American troops in the Muslim world, and our support of Israel. Now, these things, we have to recognize that this is what is one of the major causes of terror in the Middle East. Um, will we stop in our steadfast support of Israel? Um, that is a political, kind of a political, I don't want to call it a hot potato, but the current administration, the new administration, seems to be that it's going to be more pro-Israel than the previous administrations. So that, and the possible um, pro-Israel stance could further incite some of the countries and some of the terrorists in the Middle East. It's a slippery slope that we walk. In 2007, the CIA's National Intelligence Estimate warned that Iraq would become a training ground for mujahideen, and that who were willing to commit acts of terror out of a sense of pan-Islamic solidarity. And so that 2007 warning came to bear as we see ISIS grew out of parts of northern Iraq and Syria, and that's where they were formed. So the CIA, and I hate to say, saw it coming, and we saw it coming, but we were unable to stop it from happening. Again, a lot of the um, groups that are so anti-American are anti-American because of our policies in the Middle East, and particularly because of our pro-Israel policy. So, as we're beginning to see, trying to understand terrorism is a pretty complicated matter, particularly when we look at um, areas of the world such as the Middle East. The Middle East is a very, very complicated and bears a historical history to their violence that dates back centuries. In this course, though, we don't particularly spend the whole course, and you could spend 2 semesters studying terrorism in the Middle East. This book, again, is a survey, and we look at terrorism throughout the world and in different places and at different times in the world. So when we study terrorism, we make a lot of generalizations, and so when we look at the morality of political violence, we we look at the moral convictions of terrorists, um, and how they morally justify the use of violence as a weapon in their fight, in their struggle. So the use of violence, particularly among religious terrorists, in order to use violence, they have to justify it, and so in order to justify it, we'll look at some of the ways that they do, and one is a simplified version of good and evil, and to seek utopia, and from some codes of self-sacrifice. Um, but the moral justifications, terrorism is distinct from other acts of political violence because the effort is intended to be far-reaching. A broad audience is subject to influence by the act. So the motives of the terrorists are important, not just to those directly targeted. Again, what we're looking at when terrorism, um, because it's mainly a weaker force fighting a stronger opponent, they need to gain support, and so they need to gain support. In order to gain support, they need to justify their acts of violence, and sometimes the violence that they use um, gain supporters, but other times, as we'll see later on in this chapter, sometimes the violence that they use actually becomes so heinous that it actually steers people away and turns people off. People that maybe are on the fence as supporters or sympathizers. Some acts have been so terrible that they've actually um, left the cause and have moved away from uh, that group or the groups perpetrating that violence. So terrorists see the world in black and white terms. Their goals are honorable and their enemies are not. And their methods are justifiable. They're justifiable because if it's religious violence, um, they have their violence has been justified by their God. Um, they have terrorists have an unambiguous certainty in the righteousness of a cause. They're right. There's no deviating from their rightness, and they are willing to go to any extreme in order to gain the ends to their means, or the means to their ends. So the concept that a group uses concludes that it has been morally wronged by an immoral, evil enemy. In the case of, say, Hamas, they blame Israel and they call Israel an evil, immoral enemy that should not exist in the Middle East. In the case of the Irish Republican Army, they believed that Britain did not belong in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, and that they were an evil, immoral enemy, particularly because Ireland is predominantly Catholic and Britain is predominantly Protestant. So then the group concludes that it possesses an inherent moral superiority to an enemy. Our moral convictions are superior to yours. We're more holier, or our God is more holier than yours, and therefore, hence, we should prevail in our struggle. So, not every group and not every resistance movement resorts to terrorism, but when one does, they do so out of a conviction that the wrong it has suffered um, at the hands of a powerful oppressor, the only way to fight and the only way to respond is through terroristic activity. And again, a group may conclude that they are morally superior to a foe and declare that their cause is holy and just, and in that way they're able to justify the violence that ensues in their struggle. So during the 1960s, Carlos, and I apologize for my pronunciation, but Carlos Mahiela's mini manual of urban guerrilla um, was like the Bible of left wing radical groups and left wing revolutionaries, particularly in South America and Central America, and even here in the United States. But um, he said, and in his book, it says that um, acts of terror, if they are applied by a selfless revolutionary against a ruthless dictatorship, are justifiable. So, in this way, the nature of the enemy defines what forms of resistance may be used. So, if it's a ruthless dictatorship that we're fighting, then violence is certainly justifiable in Mahiela's mind and in the mind of his followers. He was able to gain a significant following, and the manual has been sort of a Bible for left wing groups throughout the world. So, terrorists are certainly seeking a utopia, um, in a world in which everyone believes and follows and believes in the same and has the same beliefs that the particular group has. Um, During the 1960s, many of the left wing groups saw utopia as a communist or socialist society in which everyone um, got a job, uh, that everyone had universal health care, everyone made the same amount of money. And a communist or leftist regime was the utopia that many of those groups were trying to install in their government when they became revolutionaries. Currently, we see that groups like ISIS would like to eradicate the West and instill Islamic beliefs and take away the rights of women and have everyone follow a strict Islamic code. And again, ISIS are radicals. That's not what every Muslim believes. It's what that radicalized version of the religion extorts. So the utopia is so valuable that terrorists believe that the ends justify the means, and that even involves wiping out or wiping away the existing order. Um, and so that is the belief system that's used by leftist groups and religious groups. Some terrorists, though, are nihilist dissidents, um, and they know that the existing utopia, they're looking for utopia, I'm sorry, but they know that the existing order must be destroyed, but they really don't know what, um, what to put in its place. These are nihilists. We also call them anarchists. And so we'll talk about anarchists later on. The anarchist movement reared its ugly head recently at the protests for the inauguration of the current president. We saw the anarchists, they were all dressed in black protesting. And it's one thing to protest, they weren't protesting, they were actually vandalizing property, destroying property, attacking stores. And so when they get into the mix, they advocate violence. They want to overthrow the government. But anarchists and nihilists, they want to overthrow the government, but they just don't know what they want to put in its place. They know that the existing government sucks. Excuse my French, that term, but they really have no alternative to put in its place. So terrorists have faith in the justice of their cause, and eventually they adopt codes of self-sacrifices in their everyday lives, and they begin to live their lives according to these codes. Martin talks about them on page 66 through 68, and so you should read him. He uses Germany's Waffen SS as an example, and Japan's Code of Bushido. Both were came about and were used by these groups, the Germans and the Japanese, during World War II. So go ahead and read those pages and read about those two groups. They're quite interesting. Japan had a suicide bombers, if you will. They were called kamikazes, and they flew their small planes into enemy vehicles when they ran out of ammunition or towards the end of the war as part of their code. So we'll finish up with seminal events. And in the war for public opinion, events can change attitudes and sway public opinion in favor or against a movement. So seminal events have often had a profound effect on the terrorist or the public. Some of the events which swayed public opinion were the terrorist attack in 1972 at the Munich Olympics, and I urge you to do further research on some of these events. Ruby Ridge, which occurred in the United States, Waco, which occurred in the United States, the Oklahoma City bombing, which also occurred in the United States. Those three events had a profound effect on the United States government and swayed public opinion depending towards overuse of government force, or in the Oklahoma City bombing, it made people aware of the far right and how deadly they had become and how deadly and how far that they would go. We'll finish up the chapter with a quick video after this slide on the Beslan School Massacre, which was an event that occurred in 2004, and it had a profound effect on the Russian public. And it was an event that allowed Putin, the president in Russia, to take a stand and eventually snuff out many of the groups from the Ukraine that were fighting for independence. And sometimes an event will give a leader the political will that they need in order to suppress an uprising, and it gives them the political will that maybe the people hadn't had prior to that. But now, when something horrific happens, it gives the leader license to go in and practically sometimes do whatever it takes to suppress the group. So we'll play the video next, and have a good week. Enjoy it.
The 1st of September 2004 saw the start of a terrifying 3-day ordeal for School Number 1 in Beslan, North Ossetia, Russia. It was the first day of the school year, traditionally called the Day of Knowledge, and usually a time for celebration. But that morning, a gang of 32 armed and masked terrorists had arrived at the school and stormed the building. Firing rifles into the air, they had forced 1,200 adults and children into the school gymnasium. Encircling them on the floor were bombs connected by cables. Bombs were taped to the walls and suspended from the ceiling. They placed children along the windows to act as a human shield. As anxious relatives waited outside, 20 of the men were taken from the gymnasium and murdered. The terrorists would not allow their bodies to be recovered. A cordon of special troops surrounded the building, and terrorists warned that if any of them were killed, 50 hostages would also die. Day 2, and after intervention by Ruslan Alchev, president of Ingushetia, 26 hostages were released, mostly mothers and babies. By this time, conditions for the hostages inside the school were intolerable. They had had no food or water for 24 hours, and as the temperature soared inside the packed gymnasium, many of the children began to faint. Later that day, 2 rocket grenades were fired from inside the building, hitting a police vehicle. There was no return fire. The risk of reprisals for the hostages was too great. It was discovered that a Muslim Chechen nationalist group was behind the siege. Day 3, and the terrorists agreed to let emergency workers in to retrieve the bodies of those killed when the school was seized. Minutes later, explosions and gunfire were heard, and then children were seen running from the school. An explosion might have been triggered accidentally by one of the terrorists or by a gunshot from a security force's sniper. The terrorists started firing on their fleeing captives, and special forces returning fire then stormed the school. Relatives, many of them armed, mingled with the troops and ran towards the buildings, many of them caught in the crossfire. At the casualty station, the first survivors started to arrive, shocked and bewildered. They were suffering from dehydration and exhaustion. 331 people died, including 186 children. More than 700 were injured. The shooting continued for hours as the remaining terrorists were pursued. Only one was taken alive. President Putin called for 2 days of national mourning for the victims of 3 of the darkest days in recent Russian history.